So I guess I just wanted to start first with welcoming you all. I'm so glad that you all are joining us and we're able to find these new ways to experience community right now. Print viewings are something we do at the museum all the time, usually with students who come in with their teachers, and our graduate student team pull works from our collection and we lead discussions about close looking. And this is kind of a challenge in that we're looking at a screen, which is very different than how the whole point of doing print viewings usually is about looking at artworks in person. Um, but I'm also excited about the possibilities that we're able to reach far beyond Chicago's walls or the museum's walls and Chicago region. So I think it's exciting that people are joining us from all over right now. So this is the first week, and every week we'll be building on different topics. I'll share with you a website at the end of the presentation where you can see the schedule and resources and download this slide set of images if you would like to refer to these images later. So we'll start with Abe Morell, and also just sort of an introduction about photography itself. So photography, the term literally translates from Greek, where photo translates to light and the graphy part translates to drawing. So the idea is that it's you're drawing with light. So photography is really just a lot about the study of light. And then cameras themselves are essentially made from creating like a darkened chamber and then using this camera obscura technique that we see in Abe Morell's image. So to create this image, Abe Morell is using his hotel room as a camera. He has darkened out all of the windows and the doors and every source of light except for a tiny sort of pinhole or aperture that he's created, a hole, to let a little bit of light in. And this is essentially how all of cameras work. Light comes through a pinhole or a small opening and projects what is on the outside onto the opposite side. So your digital cameras work in this way, your film cameras work in this way, and you can create a camera essentially out of anything. I don't know if when you all were children, you ever did a pinhole camera exercise, or even when you looked at the eclipse, if you tried using a cereal box and poking a hole in the box and looking at the sun projected on the other side as a way to see the eclipse without looking at the sun. It's all the same technology, and it's a very old technique that has been used for thousands of years. So this is something that also painters used. In this slide, we see a painter, or an illustration of how painters use this, particularly in the Renaissance painters. It's now understood that they created their own darkened chambers to project what they wanted to paint, and then essentially were able to sort of trace reality. Excuse me. So this is something that is a little hard for people to accept, that people like Da Vinci and Vermeer were using this technique in their very realistic paintings before photography was invented. So back to Abe Morell's picture. He created, let me go back to my image there. He created this image in a very recognizable place. So the image is very disorienting in a lot of ways. He's in a hotel room across from the Pantheon in Rome. So it's very recognizable architecture. And then we have the paintings and the furniture from his hotel room kind of obstructing the image very intentionally. And then also, usually when you're doing camera obscura, or always when you're doing camera obscura, the way the light refracts is it projects what is opposite of the walls upside down and backwards. So in order for Abe Morell to make this appear right side up, he also added a mirror that flipped the image right side up. And then he also, he also then held his exposure for a very, very long time in order to really record the imagery. So if any of you have tried photographing on your own in dark places, usually if you're photographing in the dark, you don't capture too much information, it becomes blurred. But if you set up a tripod and hold that exposure for a long time, you're allowing more and more light to come into that image. So on the lower right-hand corner, we see the traffic moving and the lights of the outside world kind of moving to show us that passage of time, and how Abe Morell made this photograph of a photograph with a camera inside of a camera. So it's a really fun way to start our conversation right now in talking about a little bit of the history of photography and some of these ideas that artists are showing us. So next, in thinking about light, one of my favorite artists to talk about clever ways to play with light is Harry Callahan. I should add that everything we're talking about today is part of the museum's permanent collection. So of course there's other great examples of artists doing this, but I'm using the work that we have in our own collection. So this image is one that I love to show students when they start to get sleepy and don't comment too much, because at first a lot of them think they're looking at a landscape or perhaps even a line drawing, and they're not quite sure what they're looking at. But then after they sit with it for a little while, students usually pretty easily realize that they are looking at a close-up of a person's backside. So it's actually an image of a nude woman, and it's just the kind of crease of her butt and her legs. And Harry Callahan has added a lot of light to this image to really abstract it. You don't see the details of her skin or any kind of wrinkles or freckles. You really just get these contours of where the skin meets. And so this is an example of using light choices to really add to the composition and to create abstraction. Harry Callahan taught famously at the Institute of Design, which is a really famous school in Chicago that was founded by Laszlo Moholy-Nagy in 1937. And the Institute of Design really trained a lot of these photographers that we now know so well in our history books. Harry Callahan taught with Aaron Siskind, and they really encouraged experimentation and using light to abstract and thinking of light as like a modernist design excuse me, element. So this image here is sort of the opposite of the last we looked at. Instead of giving us a lot of light, he's instead putting the light source behind his subject, and instead obscuring her body, you just have her body as pure form and in pure shadow. But when you see this image in person, what I love to point out or have students notice is at the very top, you can see like a little sliver of light where her hand meets. You can see a little bit of sliver of light right above her right breast. And you can kind of get this sense of intimacy even with such little amount of information. Excuse me, I got something in my throat. So Harry Callahan photographed his wife, Eleanor, for over 15 years. And she was his muse and kind of his always willing subject. But she also had a lot of feelings about how she wanted to be photographed and how she was comfortable being depicted. So she was comfortable with nudity from the backside, but not from the front. And this was one way that he worked with her to show her and to show like the intimacy of their relationship with her being comfortable and not revealing her in a way that she didn't want to be seen. Here's another image of her in a very similar pose. It is from a year earlier, so it's not the same day that he photographed. But again, in this pose of putting her arms over her head, but instead we see the framing choice very differently. So a way that he's, again, preserving her privacy is by cropping the image to where her nudity is not revealed, but it's implied. So we have instead this very beautiful eye contact that she's making that shows, again, the intimacy and their closeness and the relationship. And this print is just stunning in person. As a gelatin silver print, all the tonalities and the grays are really beautiful. So if any of you are in the Chicago region, once we're back to our regularly scheduled programming, you can always make an appointment to come see our collection at any time, and we can always pull these prints for you. And then we have another example of something Callahan did where he photographed a lot of architecture. He didn't just photograph his wife and his daughter. This also shows Barbara, but he's photographing them with the architecture in a way that he's almost considering them another design principle. It's not what we would normally expect of a family photograph. They're very far away from him. It's a very like, typically people would do their subject matter is much closer up. But if you look at these kind of two columns the two telephone poles, you can see that he's sort of using them again in this composition right in the middle, creating this kind of perfect design with their bodies. So he really was an innovator, I think, with the way he composed his photographs with the framing and also with his source of light and shadow. So we can, right now, if we have any questions, I would love to hear. I see some chats here that I haven't yet opened. Is everyone able to hear me okay? I guess you don't have to comment. Great, okay. So does anyone have any questions for right now from anything we've talked about? Okay. This is such a different format that I'm not used to. So we'll keep going and I'll just periodically check the questions when we get to a good stopping point. So speaking of the Institute of Design and Harry Callahan, this is one of Harry Callahan's students, Yasuhiro Ishimoto. He was photographing the series that I'm going to show you today in Chicago. This was from a project called Chicago, Chicago, that was published as a book in, I believe, 1969. And Ishimoto has an interesting background that I think really adds to how his photographs were made. He was born in San Francisco in 1921, and then when he was 3 years old, he returned to Japan with his parents, grew up there, and then came back to the US to study for college, and then and he came here, I'm forgetting the year, anyway, he came here about 20 years later to study. And then, of course, World War II broke out, and Ishimoto was put into an internment camp for 2 years. And while he was in the internment camp, that's when he took up photography. And when he was released, he came to Chicago to first study architecture at Northwestern University, and then transferred to the Institute of Design, where he studied with Harry Callahan and Aaron Siskind. So he continued photographing here for many, many years. And when the civil rights movement started to develop, and of course race relations continued to become more and more tense, Ishimoto really photographed that moment from this view of understanding this insider-outsider perspective of being an American but not seen as an equal citizen. So he photographed a lot in the city and people sort of on the street, depicting, I think, this sort of tense time, but in a way that is very like heavily symbolic. So here we have kind of the divide of the column of the architecture, where we have white children on the other side of Black children. A lot of times they're not heavy-handed compositions, but these little details give you a sense of kind of the mood and the temperature of Chicago during the 50s. Here, again, going back to this image, it's eerie right now, seeing images in the news where we see people isolated like this. But at the time, this would be a really hard picture to take, because photographing in Chicago without anyone else around your subject, and your subject right there, spotlit by the light source with the flag illuminated over his head, is just such a striking composition with so much symbology, and also giving the mood of this kind of dark period. And then we have some images again on the street. Here's another where the flag reappears, so that's kind of a recurring motif in the series. This one I think also really implies kind of a broken system and a fraught country and a fraught city. Oops, sorry, went too fast. This one is one of my favorites that we have by him. Again, sort of not too heavy-handed with the symbolism, but we have these sort of white mannequins on the left and then a person of color on the right. And you get sort of this sense again of a very divided country. But this image to me also segues into a topic that I wanted to talk about that Roy DeCarava really addresses in his work. And that's about film not really being, I guess, free of racial bias, the film technologies that we know. So back when you would take your rolls of film to be developed, the photo lab would calibrate the color to skin tones that were kind of what they thought was the standard for normal. And if you had darker skin, you essentially, the details of your skin would sort of be left out, because light meters and the film calibration technologies were adjusted to lighter skin tones. So when we see in Ishimoto's image here, a lot of the details of his face aren't seen. And part of that is just the actual technology of the film. And you can sort of see also how Ishimoto is trying to brighten it around the man's ear. You see where it's kind of like been brought up to bring out some of that detail. Roy DeCarava was a photographer who believed in instead further darkening his images. Not all of his images were taken in this way, but he was photographing his experience as a Black man in New York and showing sort of his life and the people he knew and life in civil rights marches, and documented a lot of the events going on in the world. But instead of trying to work with his light meters and brighten his images to show his subjects, he instead lowered the light levels even further, printed them very dark, celebrating Blackness and really showing the kind of beauty and the subtlety of his subjects too. And also thinking about the right for people to maybe not be seen in a photograph, that sometimes we can tell stories without giving away the privacy of subjects. There's a really, really beautiful article about Roy DeCarava's work written by one of my favorite art writers, Teju Cole, where he says, "What is dark is neither black nor empty. It is in fact full of wise light, which with patient seeing can open out into glories." So that was in a New York Times article that I can share on our resource page for anybody who'd like to see it. And again, these are used for the screen right now. The prints in person are even darker, and you really have to sit with them for a while and sort of have your eyes adjust to see some of the details. But they are some of my favorite works in our collection. All right, any questions for now? So I can't zoom any images out, but I will include a PDF of all of this where you can download, and then also all these works are on our collection page. So you can look on our website to hopefully be able to see more detail. I'm just kind of using a PowerPoint. Oh, and also I'll be recording this. So this is being recorded right now, and we'll also make this available on our website to answer Bennett's question about if you can record it. All right.
I'm not sure if everybody's aware that you can unmute yourself.
Oh, okay. I can mute everyone in here. Thank you. Okay. Thank you for that. Great. Okay, so we'll keep going. This is what the Shirley card looked like. And then we should decide if we want. Okay. So this is what the Shirley card looked like from what I was talking about, of how they kind of decided what the normal skin tone should look like. And this was something that was developed in 1946, mid-1940s. And then it wasn't updated until the 90s. So this is a picture of one from 78, and this is one from 1995 when they finally decided to make Shirley cards with varying skin tones. But even webcams today still have problems recognizing darker skin tones. So it's just something to think about, which kind of changed my whole viewpoint of photography when I learned about this. Okay, so again, thinking about the Institute of Design's vast impact on photography, this is another photographer who studied at the Institute of Design. His name is Ken Josephson. He still lives in Chicago, is still photographing and printing his own photographs in his darkroom. And he was one of the first photographers to really think about the medium conceptually. So he played a lot with the limitations of the photograph and thinking about how when we see a photograph, it's one select view of the world, it's not truthful. And this is one of my favorite conversations to have with students, is about whether or not a photograph is a truthful document, and thinking about how we read the news and see images day to day. It's so easy to believe that that is exactly how that event occurred, but Ken Josephson's work reminds us that it's one select view, one very narrow frame, and it's very, very limited. So he was doing this pretty boldly in the 70s, or even earlier in the 60s, when photography was really still fighting for appreciation in the fine art world and being exhibited in museums or galleries. So for him to early criticize it, or not really criticize it, but to point at its limitations was really bold. So this image shows us not only another photograph of a body of water that could have been taken of a boat, it also gives away his own arm and showing us that there's a human being behind that camera, and there's a human being who's a white man making that choice. So a lot of his images show his hand, show himself in the photos, but also show multiple versions of that same place with different types of photos. So this is one that I also love in our collection, where he started with a photograph of a tree, zoomed out, then he put that photograph on a tree, photographed it again, and then put that photograph on the tree and photographed it again. So it's almost like a fractal of sorts, showing us all these kind of multiple layers of how you could photograph a moment. This is one of his son playing with a toy gun, but what I love about it is the shadow on the left, again, giving away the photographer and showing that there's a person interpreting that moment. So next we'll move into Berenice Abbott's work. So Berenice Abbott I like to show after Ken Josephson because she really didn't believe in photographic abstraction, even though I think this photograph is very beautifully abstract and goes right in line with all of that work we just talked about in the Institute of Design. Berenice Abbott was making these pictures for science textbooks. So she was not trying to show us like a painting with light, which is what I see this as, but instead trying to demonstrate how light moves. So for this image in particular, she took a glass prism filled with water and then put 6 light beams underneath it. And so you see the light moving through air where it intersects with glass and water, and turns with the prism, and then comes back out again. So the whole point is to show how light moves as a scientific illustration. Here's another image where she's taking a ball on a string and then moved it and taken multiple exposures. So capturing it at certain intervals to show the movement of that ball and gravity. And then here we have an image where she's added a light to the middle of a sphere and on the edge, and then rolled it across the table holding a very long exposure, so recording the light movement. And so with these images, they're very different than the work she did normally, which was photographing architecture in New York. But I think what's so interesting about her is that she was just so against photography being used abstractly. And so a quote from her that I enjoy is where she said, I believe in the 1920s, that abstraction in photography is ridiculous and only an imitation of painting. We stopped imitating painters 100 years ago, so to imitate them in this day and age is laughable. So I love Berenice Abbott's work. I clearly disagree with her on that, and I wonder what she would think now. But I think these images in person are just stunning, large prints, and I highly encourage, if you can see them in person or come visit our museum, to come see them. All right, any questions as we keep going? I know I'm going a little fast. So the Shirley card, in what way did it change your view on photography? I guess in that I never thought about the materials themselves having bias or having the capacity to shape the way the images were being seen. Clearly that makes sense now. It was just one of those things that it never clicked in my brain until I saw DeCarava's work and learned about the Shirley cards. If there's any other questions, feel free to add them before we keep going. All right. Okay, so last but not least, and then we'll have some time for questions, because this is so different than our normal print viewing, where instead of me just talking, usually with students, we have a long time of, what do you see in this image? What makes you say that? With 106 people, which I'm so excited so many people are joining us, we obviously can't do that in the same way. So we can open it up for discussion, I think, once we get through these, if anybody wants to talk. Okay, so I love this image too, and this artist. So in our fundamentals of photography print viewing, we go over a lot of black and white work, and we go out over a lot of more historical work. But I like to end with talking about a more contemporary photographer who I think is employing a lot of the same ideas. This is by Clarissa Bonet. She is a local Chicago photographer, pretty young, and she's using a digital camera to make this work. And again, what I said earlier about how the images we're seeing in the news right now, like that Ishimoto image, seems so eerie before 3 weeks ago. And now this is something that seems very normal in our streets if you walk around. So Clarissa, to make this work, she lives in Chicago, and she will walk around kind of downtown where it's very crowded and there's a lot of people out and about. And she'll take these sketches, what she calls them, or sketches, with her iPhone. So if she sees a moment that she appreciates, she'll kind of quickly capture it, and then she'll flesh out her idea to come back with a model and with her lighting, and in a time of day when no one else is around, so like very early in the morning. So this moment that she saw of a man crossing a crosswalk with his clothing kind of mirroring the composition of the crosswalk, the flag that's like right next to the stoplight. I love, and thinking about Ishimoto's picture that we saw earlier. To me, this is like a modern day reinterpretation of that image. It kind of symbolizes, again, this feeling of isolation, or what it means to be American in this very like large capitalist society. So her pictures, I just think, are so stunning, and how she uses light and shadow to create drama and the mood of kind of feeling alone in a very dense urban environment. So this is one image. Then we have another that I really love. She's placed 3 people in kind of cascading in and out of a building. And I love just imagining her walking around the city, noticing these details, and then figuring out a way to come and make them in her own way. I think she does use Photoshop some to kind of clean them up and simplify it. And that, of course, was not technology that was available to the people at the Institute of Design, but she, I think, is using a lot of their sort of design principles in the way she works. So she's really interesting, and we're hoping, eventually, we haven't yet asked Clarissa, but we're hoping to do some online studio visits with some of these artists that we work with at the museum, and we hope she says yes when we ask her, so that will be something we can look forward to. But this wraps up everything I was going to talk about for right now with fundamentals. We will put, again, all of this online and the recording online, but I wanted to, I see there's a lot of conversation going on about where people are from. Is there anything that anybody wants to say? If you want your microphone turned on, I would be happy for hearing any comments of things people want to talk about or discuss more. So about the Shirley card, again, I'm not going to go back and talk about it, but we'll have the recording up. I don't believe they're being used anymore. They might still have them in some Kodak processing labs, but I don't think that people still use the Shirley card. There's another question from Christy Kahns about Aaron Siskind and his influence. Yeah, I almost put Aaron Siskind in this image set, and I was worried about time, and now I wish I had. We have a lot of Aaron Siskind in our collection. He was using his camera to document graffiti up close and marks sort of in the urban environment that looked a lot like painting. He was really influenced by Franz Klein's paintings, was a friend of Franz Klein. So a lot of the close-up works he was taking of kind of marks in the city of graffiti or painting, or just even like construction sites where things have been painted over look like he's painting. So we have a lot of Aaron Siskind. There's other series, of course, that's what he's most well known for. And I think that now that I know people are interested in hearing more about him, we can talk about him in another session. So coming up, We have, so right here I'm sharing the link for where you can download these resources. I also forgot to mention at the beginning, we talked about camera obscura, is there's a really fun tutorial about how to do that yourself. And so since we're all spending a lot of time at home right now, you can make your own aid morale if you want to, if you want to try to turn your room into camera obscura and photograph it. We're having a bit of a contest on social media where you can share those images with us. And people who win that contest will get either store credit in our shop or copies of books. We're kind of still working out the prizes. But we would love to see you all try to do your own camera obscuras in your rooms. And then upcoming next week, so we'll do this every Wednesday at noon, but next week, our graduate student and curatorial assistant, Emily Plunkett, is going to talk about people who photograph in the domestic spaces. So photograph within their homes or their family members or close friends, thinking about how we all can use this time to really grow creatively. She'll be showing a lot of works in our collection of artists who've been doing that for a long time. And then let's see some other questions we have. The light process. So Jacoby is wondering what the light process that Clarissa did for a crosswalk photo. I believe to create that image, she photographs very early in the morning. So that's when the light is moving in the direction that she wants it, but also when nobody is on the streets. So like 5 or 6 a.m. I believe that's how she does it. I know she also sets up some of her own lights to create dramatic lighting, but with certain things like the way the light moves in between buildings, you can only do so much with your own lighting. So I think it's a mix of both like her own lighting that she sets up and the time of day. Let's see what other questions people have. Yeah, from 12 to 1 is the normal time. We'll also be doing, again, we're trying to really think creatively about how we can keep our education programs working in these new platforms. So we're talking about adding some studio visits by artists online. We have a podcast, if you all haven't heard it, that I run with our graduate students and our education team where we interview artists. So also if you're interested in Roy DeCarava and learning more about his work in particular, there's a great episode with Teju Cole and Dawood Bey, and they both talk a lot about Roy DeCarava's work. So I highly encourage you all to download that. The podcast is called Focal Point, and you can download it on Apple or anywhere you get your podcasts. It's also linked on our website. So let's see. Bennett asked if I could elaborate on my feelings of photography being used creatively, contrary to Berenice Abbott. I didn't at all mean that to sound like I'm critical of Berenice Abbott. I love Berenice Abbott. I was just, I guess, curious about her ideas on abstraction and how she would feel today, because I think those science pictures, you have to be extremely creative to illustrate the movement of light and gravity and physics the way that she's trying to do. I also think they're perfect compositions. To me, that's painting with light. That really is painting with light to like the best definition. So, I mean, I think, I don't know, about creatively using photography. I think everyone that we showed today is doing that for sure in different ways. And there's infinite ways to do that. Let's see. Yeah, and so Joan, you asked about if I could share the set of images. This PDF will be available on the link that is shared here. So you can download this PDF. And also every artist, if you search on our website, you can see the work that's searchable. Our collection is searchable. Let's see what else. I think that's maybe all of the questions. Maybe I can just unmute everyone. The link for the next Zoom meeting will be the exact same. So this is always going to be the same link every week. It'll be a different person presenting. I'll probably present again, but we're going to use our great team of graduate students to present. And the schedule is also on this link. So next week is photographing the domestic, and then the following week will be photographing landscape and place. So as you're out on your nature walks or walking around outdoors trying to observe the sunshine, you can hopefully be inspired by those sets of images, and we'll go over a lot of the history of landscape photography all the way up to what people are doing right now. And then after that, we'll do a session on color theory, and one about constructed and stage images. So that's what we have scheduled for now. But this will be growing as we understand more and more how long the museum will be closed. Okay, I'm going to unmute everyone if you would like to sign in. Would anyone like to comment or add anything? Everyone's closing and saying, no, I don't have any.
Thank you, Kristen.
Thank you all for coming.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank
All
you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. It was great.
We look forward to seeing your camera obscura images. Please participate. And you don't have to do it out of your room. You can make camera obscura out of anything. We would love to see what you do. We hope you get creative.
Thank you, Kristen. This was wonderful.
Thank you. Thank you. Bye.
Where do we find the link to the contest that you were talking about?
That will just be announced on our social media. So just keep an eye on if you follow us on Instagram or Facebook or Twitter, and then it'll probably also be included in our newsletter. But our manager of marketing and community engagement will be posting that soon with details. So there's a great tutorial that I think is like very well done about how to, if you want to do it, it's on that link. But yeah, again, you can make a pinhole camera or any kind of interpretation of camera. We'd love to see it.
Okay.
Can we receive details through the MoCP email blast?
I'm sorry, can you repeat that?
Will we receive details on everything you do through the email that we receive from MoCP?
Yeah. So we'll share that link to our.
Thank you for this. This was great.
Great, thank you so much for joining us. All right. Well, I look forward to seeing you next week. Have a good week. Take care. Make some photos.
Thank you.
Thank you.